Very good afternoon. Myself Dr. Ruchi Gupta, Associate Professor, IT Department. Today we will discuss the coding concept. We have already covered two phases of SDLC in detail. One is software requirement analysis phase and the second one is design phase. So once we have to complete the analysis phase, then we get some output from this analysis phase, that is called SRS, software requirement specification, and this become the input for the next phase of SDLC, that is design phase. So once we have to complete the whole designing of the software, then we again prepare one document regarding the designing phase, that is called software design document. And once we have to prepare this design document, now we will go or insert into the third phase of SDLC, that is coding phase. So now today we will discuss about the coding phase, coding, and that is your third phase of SDLC. So what is coding? Coding is not only any creativity activity, but also but this is, if you know any of the programming language, then you can easily code the project. So we can say that it is not a creative activity, but also an intellectual rigorous discipline, and coding is undertaken once the design phase is to be completed. As I have already discussed that the design document is to be used for the coding purpose. So the design phase is completed and the design document has been successfully reviewed and verified, then only we will start the coding of any project. So it is a part of software engineering where the decision is actually translated in any machine readable form. So we have just start the programming in this phase, and we have just translate any problem into the machine readable form, which is called program, and the process of this coding is called a programming. So if we are a developer, if we are a programmer, and if we have a knowledge of any programming language, then we can easily translate the problem into a programming. So in the coding phase, each and every module and specified in the term in the design document is independently coded and unit tested. So if we have to write the program, if we have implement any module, then we are responsible for test this particular module independently. So that is come under unit testing. So any developer who is responsible for coding is responsible for testing of this particular module. So these are some coding concept. There are many declarations about the coding or programming. So first of all, the programmer must be familiar with as many techniques as possible, aware of the pros and cons of, and able to recognize the situation of their applications. So we can say that if the programmer have enough knowledge about the programming, then they can easily aware the concept of these pros and cons, which will recognize at the time of programming, or we can say that they can easily understand or identify the bugs which comes under programming. So proper understanding of nature and structure of data, it is essential prerequisite to the construction of any program. So until we know the designing very clearly, we can't implement the project or any program. So this is a basic thing, that a proper understanding and of nature and structure of the data, it is essential for any program. And despite the appearance of correctness of solutions, the prime criteria in judging a program are structure and style rather than cleverness of the algorithm. So we have just apply the coding, we have just applied the logic in terms that it is very clear, the logics are very clear to the developer, and we can easily judge a program. So most of software developer organization formulate their own coding standards. So any organization, they can create their own coding standard as per their programming platform. That suit the most and require their engineers to follow, but some coding standards which will follow by each and every programmer. These are some basic coding standards that any of the programmer that have any of the programming concept, they can apply these coding standards. So, good software developer organizations normally require the programmer to adhere some well-defined standard style of coding, which is called coding standards. So, the purpose of the requirements, all the engineers of the organizations to adhere a standard style of the coding, which is following a coding standard. It gave a uniform appearance to the code written by the different engineers. So, if we have write the program with some coding standards, so if any of the programmer can write the program, but the program, it should be the appearance of the program, it should be common, because all the programmers use the same coding standards. It enhances coding understanding, as I have already told you that if we are using a common coding standards, then any programmer coding is to be understood by the another programmer. It encourages good programming practices. So, a coding standard lists several rules to the followed during coding. So, we have to follow some rules or standards during programming or during implementation of any program, such as the way variables are to be named. So, when we have to declare the variables, so we will give a specific or unique name for the variables, the way the code is to be laid out, error return, convention, etc. So, these are some basic concepts which we have consider or which we have to kept in mind at the time of programming. So, these are some coding guidelines and standards, or we can say these are basic standards or guidelines which are followed by each and every programmer. So, good software development organizations usually develop their own coding standards and guidelines, which depending on what best own coding standards and guidelines, and depending on what best suits their organization and the type of products they develop. So, these are some respective coding standards and guidelines. So, we have follow these standards and guidelines. First, a naming convention. So, some of the standard naming conventions that are followed. The first one is a package name that should be in the lowercase. So, when we have to define any package, it should be in the lowercase. Always we have to declare the package in the lowercase form. And the type names, it should be noun and should start with some uppercase. So, when we have to declare some nouns and short, then they always start with some uppercase. For example, day, date of birth, event handler, etc. Variables name, it should be a noun starting with the variables name. So, a variable name is always start with some lowercase, for example, name, amount. Constant name, it should always start with some uppercase, for example, pi, max, jetter, etc., etc. So, method name, it should be a verb and it should also be a lowercase. For example, get value, it is a method. So, we always start with we always declare it with the lowercase. Private class variable, it always start with some suffix value, like suffix private int value. Some standard will require this is to be prefix. Variables with a large scope, it should have a long name. Variables with some small scope and can have a short name. Loop iterations, it should have like I, J, K, etc. So, we have some specific, should be specific for the loops or iterations variables, like we always declare it with I, J, K types. The prefix should be used for the Boolean variables and methods to avoid confusion. For example, is a status, it should be used instead of status, because so that we can easily differentiate the methods and the Boolean variables. Negative Boolean variables always defined with the it should be avoided, and for example, it should not correct. The term compute, it can be used for the method where something is being computed, and the term find can be used where something is being looked up. For example, a compute mean, find mean, exception, class should be suffixed with exception. So these are some compute words. So we always start with these letters. If we are talking about the files, so there are some conventions of files also. So convention how the file should be named. So when we have to save any file, so how we can save the files? So there are some conventions or files should be named, and what file should contain. So first of all, we have to check that what is the content under the file. So we have to give the name related to their content. What files should contain, such that reader can get some idea about what is the file contains. Some examples of these conventions are like Java source file should have an extension .java. This is enforced by most compilers and tools. Each file should contain outer class and the class name that should be the same as the file name. Line length should be limited, less than 80 in the column and spacing character when you have to write any code. So in a single line, we have to consider that the words or the program, it should not less than 80 columns, and special characters should be avoided. If the line is longer, it should be counted, and continuation should be made very clearly. So what we have considered for the statements, variables, it should be initialized where declared. Declare related variables together in a common statement. Unrelated variable, it should not be declared in the same statement. Class variable, if we are talking about the class variable, it should never be declared publicly. Loop variables, it should be initialized immediately before the loop. Use only loop control statements in a loop. Avoid the break and continue in a loop. Avoid the use of do while construct. And we also avoid executable statement in conditionals. We also consider some commenting and layouts. There should be comments for all major variables explaining what they represent. A block of comments should be predicated by a blank comment line with just star and dash, and ended with a file containing just star and dash. Single line comment for a block of code should be aligned with the code that are mean for. So as per the coding standard, there are some coding guidelines also which we have considered. Control construct, it is desirable that much as possible use of single entry and single. So we have to consider that at the time of coding we have the possible use of single entry and single exit. Do not use go to statement. Proper layout, we have considered that we have used a proper layout. Proper indentation, blank spaces, parentheses should be used to enhance the readability of the program. Information hiding means only the access function of the data structure should be visible. Module size and interface, the length of any function, it should be less. Side effect, when a module is invoked, it should sometimes have a side effect when we have to modify the program. So we have avoid some side effects also. We also consider the nesting. If nesting of if then else construct become too deep, then the logic harder to understand. As we have seen here in this example, like if we have a multiple nesting, multiple ifs, so it is it looks like very complex code. So if the different conditions are disjoint, this structure can be converted into the following. So we have to convert this structure into this format, so it can be easily understandable, and this sequence of statement will produce the same result as the earlier sequence, but it is much easier to understand than the previous code. This is an incremental coding process which we have to follow at the time of programming. We have to write some code to implement functionality. Then enhance the test script. We have to test that script. We have to run that script. If there is some error occur, then we have to fix the bug and again run the script. If there is no error, then all the spaces are covered, and then we will exit from the coding. And if it is no, then again we have to write some code for implement the functionality. So it is an iterated process, and we have to repeat this process until we have to write the code correctly. So this is code review is one of the method of code inspection. So once we have to write the code, then we have to review that code. So this is a code review process. So code review for a model is carried out after the module is to be successfully compiled and all the syntax errors have been eliminated. Then we have to review this code again. Code review, it is extremely a very cost effective strategy for the reduction in coding errors and to produce a high quality code. And this is basically a static approach of testing. So there are two type of code review techniques are available: code walkthrough and code inspection. These are some coding principles. Simplicity, it should be simple. The code is to be, it is easy to understandable, easy to readable. A proper documentation is also required for the coding. If we have to change, if we want to change in the coding, then it is easy to modify. Predictability is also one principle of this coding. There should be a consistency. We have to consider that the consistency is to be maintained in input and output. Module interdependency is also considered at the time of coding, and there should be a good programming structure. So code walkthrough is an informal method of code analysis. In this technique, after a module has been coded successfully, compiled, all the syntax errors are to be eliminated, then a group of some members, a few members of the development team are given to that code which is already compiled and successfully eliminated the errors. So code walkthrough meeting to read and understand that code manually, and each member selects some test cases and simulates the execution of the code by hand, because I have just said that it is a static method of testing. So trace execution through each statement and fault execution. So the main objective of this walkthrough are to discover the algorithm and logical errors in the code. We have just detect some logical errors of the code, not a syntax error. So the members note down their bugs or errors, and they have discussed this in a walkthrough meeting where the code of the module is to be present. These are some guidelines for the walkthrough. The term performing code walkthrough, it should not be either too long or too big. It should consist between 3 to 7 members. So the team which is decided for the code review, they have just 3 to 7 members and they have enough knowledge of the programming. Discussion should focus on discovery of errors, not how to fix and discover the error. So the team members only focus about the discovery of the errors. They have not focused about that how the errors may be fixed. In order to foster cooperation and avoid the feeling among the engineers that they are being evaluated in the code walkthrough meeting, and managers should not attend the walkthrough meetings. This is another method, that is a code inspection method. So the aim of code inspection is also to discover some common type of errors that is caused due to improper programming. And during code inspection, the code is to be examined for the presence of certain kind of errors, and in contrast the hand simulation, we have done code walkthrough. So good software developers collect some static different type of error commonly committed by the engineers and identify the errors most frequently committed. Such a list of common committed errors can be inspected to look out the possible error. So these are some list of errors which have to be considered at the time of code inspection. So, following a list of some classical programming errors that is checking during the code inspection. One is use of some uninitialized variables, jump into loops, non-terminating loops, incomplete assignment, array indices out of bounds, improper storage and allocation, mismatch between actual and formal parameter in procedure, use of some incorrect logical operator or correct precedence among operators, proper notification of loop variables, and comparison of equality of floating point variables, etc. So, these are some errors which we have considered at the time of programming. So, then we have considered the debugging. Debugging is also a methodological process of finding and reducing the number of bugs in a computer program or a piece of electronic hardware. The basic purpose of this debugging is to identify the errors in a program and then fix it. So, whole debugging procedure is shown in this figure. This is a debugging process. These are some, we have generated some test cases, then execution of these test cases, we got some results, we get some results after execution of these test cases, then we have applied the debugging process, we have to correct. If there are some suspected cases, then we have add some additional cases and apply the regression test cases on this process, and this is the whole process of debugging. These are some approaches of debugging. Brute force. In this approach, the program is loaded with some print statement to print the intermediate value with the hope, and sum of printed values will help to identify the statement or of error. Backtracking method. This is also a fairly common approach. In this approach, beginning from the statement at which the error symptoms has been observed, and we have to backtrack until the error is to be discovered. So, we can say that we have to backtrack the whole program until we have to identify the error in the program. This is another method of debugging, cause elimination method. In this approach, a list of causes which could possibly have contributed to error symptoms is developed and tests conducted to eliminate each. A related technique of identification of error from the error symptom, it is fault tree analysis method. Another method is a program slicing method of debugging. So, this technique is similar to backtracking method. Here we also backtrack the whole program, but in this case the search space is reduces into the slices. A slice of program for a particular variable at a statement is set to source line, and that preceding this statement can influence the value of the variable. So, these are some methods of debugging. So, once we have to complete this coding and code review process, and when we get that program is correct, when we have to perform the unit testing in the coding phase, then we have to go or insert into the next phase of SDLC, that is testing phase. So, in the next lecture, we have discussed about the testing or testing approaches. So, thank you very much.